You may have heard of Colditz Castle, a huge stone fortress in the middle of Germany. During World War II, it became a prison for captured Allied officers, the ones who had already tried to escape from other camps. To the guards, Colditz was escape-proof. Thick walls, watchtowers, locked doors, they believed no one could ever get out. But what they didn't know was that inside those same walls, a group of prisoners was quietly building something extraordinary. Not a weapon, not a tunnel, a radio. A secret radio that could pick up voices from the outside world. Voices that spoke of freedom, of hope, of home. The men used anything they could find. Bits of wire, scrap metal, old light bulbs. One of them hid the radio inside an ordinary metal teapot, something small enough to pass any quick inspection. Every night, after the lights went out, they would gather close and turn the tiny dial. At first, just static. Then, a whisper through the noise. "This is London calling." In that moment, the walls seemed to fade. The cold stone didn't feel so heavy anymore. For a few minutes, they were connected again to the world beyond the gates. They learned news that wasn't allowed to reach them. They heard that the war was changing, that one day they might go home. To them, the secret radio was more than a machine. It was a symbol of imagination and courage, a reminder that even when you are locked away, your mind can still be free. The story of that radio and the clever disguises that followed was never part of the official records. But today, we can finally tell it. This is the real story behind Colditz's secret radio and disguises. A story of creativity, quiet rebellion, and the unbreakable human spirit. Because sometimes the smallest invention can keep hope alive. By the early 1940s, the war had spread across Europe. Thousands of Allied officers had been captured and sent to special prison camps known as Oflags, short for Offizierslager, meaning officers' camp. Among them, one camp stood out above all the rest, Oflag 4C, better known as Colditz Castle. Built hundreds of years earlier on a rocky hill, Colditz looked more like a medieval fortress than a prison. Thick stone walls, heavy gates, towers that looked over the town below. From the outside, it was quiet, almost peaceful. But inside, it was filled with men who refused to give up. The guards believed they had gathered the most difficult prisoners, the ones who had already escaped from other camps. So Colditz became the so-called escape-proof prison, a place for men who could not be trusted to sit still. But that idea, that a place could be completely escape-proof, only challenged them more. Inside those walls, something remarkable happened. The prisoners didn't just survive. They built a hidden world of their own. There were small theaters for plays, classrooms for language lessons, and even art studios. Some men painted, some played music, others read and taught each other. And deep inside the castle, in a quiet room under the roof, a few men turned their skills to something much more daring. They were engineers, electricians, and inventors in civilian life. Together, they started what they secretly called the workshop. From broken flashlights and old batteries, they collected wires and parts. From tin cans and empty boxes, they built tiny tools. Everything was used, even paper clips and pieces of wood from furniture. Their goal wasn't to fight. It was to connect, to find a signal from the outside world. At that time, all outside news was blocked. The only information the prisoners heard came from official sources, and those weren't always true. So they wanted to know, what's really happening out there? Are our countries still fighting? Do they even remember us? That question burned inside them. It was what pushed them to take a risk that could cost them everything. For months, they worked in silence. They hid their tools after each session, covering the small space with books and blankets. The guards never suspected that a secret radio was taking shape only a few steps above their heads. No official record from the time mentions this radio. It wasn't in German reports. It wasn't in Red Cross papers. It wasn't even confirmed by Allied records after the war. But after the castle was freed in 1945, soldiers found pieces of wire, notes with frequency numbers, and a hand-drawn plan for a small receiver. That evidence, along with the stories told by the men who lived there, proved that the secret radio of Colditz was real. It may not have changed the war, but for the men inside, it changed something even more important: their sense of hope. They realized that even in silence, even surrounded by walls, they could still think, build, and believe. What happened next would take that creativity even further, from radio wires to uniforms, disguises, and daring plans to walk straight through the front gate. What came next wasn't just another escape plan. It was a lesson in how imagination can survive anywhere. Inside the tall stone walls of Colditz Castle, life followed the same pattern every day. Wake up, line up, eat, wait. For many men, the hardest battle wasn't with guards. It was against boredom and the silence that filled every corner. But a few prisoners refused to let that silence win. They were engineers, electricians, and pilots before the war, men who knew how machines worked and how to make something out of almost nothing. One of them was Jim, a young engineer from England. Another was Stefan, a pilot from Poland with quick hands and a curious mind. Late at night, when most men were asleep, Jim and Stefan climbed up to a dusty storage room in the attic. It was small, barely large enough for 2 people to sit. But to them, it was more than a room. It was their secret workshop. They gathered anything they could find: broken flashlights, pieces of wire from old beds, bits of metal from food tins. Even a razor blade and pencil lead became useful tools. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to build something impossible: a tiny radio receiver. Not to send messages, just to listen. "If we can hear London," Jim whispered one night, "then we'll know the world hasn't forgotten us." After weeks of quiet work, the little device was finally ready. It fit neatly inside a metal teapot, small, ordinary, and easy to hide if anyone came close. That night, they connected a long wire to the roof beams and held their breath as Jim turned the tiny knob. At first, nothing, only static like rain on glass. Then, suddenly, a voice. "This is London calling." The 2 men froze. The voice was faint, broken by static, but real. London, the outside world. For the first time in years, they weren't alone. They listened until the signal faded away, afraid to speak, afraid that any word might break the spell. In that dark attic, surrounded by stone and silence, they smiled. The walls of Colditz were still standing, but in their minds, something had already escaped. That night, the secret engineers of Colditz proved a simple truth: you can lock a door, but you can't lock imagination. From that night on, the little radio in the teapot became a secret heartbeat inside Colditz. Only a handful of men knew it existed. They called themselves the listeners. Every few nights, when the guards were done with inspections, the listeners would sneak to the attic, cover the small light with a blanket, and turn the radio on, just for a few minutes. The signal wasn't always clear. Sometimes all they heard was static. But when the voice from London came through, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. This is London calling. Those 4 words meant everything. They meant connection. They meant hope. The prisoners took notes on whatever they could find: the back of a food label, a scrap of toilet paper, a torn piece of an old envelope. When morning came, they would quietly pass those notes around the castle. To keep it secret, they turned the messages into short phrases. "The clouds are heavy today" meant bad news. "The sun will shine soon" meant a victory somewhere. That way, even if a guard overheard, it would sound like simple talk about the weather. Soon, the whispers spread from one room to another. A Polish pilot might tell a French officer. A British major would share it during roll call. And by the end of each day, the entire castle seemed to know what was happening outside. They started calling it the Colditz Chronicle. It wasn't printed, it wasn't official, but it was real, a newspaper of hope passed from man to man. The Chronicle told them the Allies were advancing. It told them the war was turning. It reminded them that their families were still out there, waiting for them to come home. For the men of Colditz, those small pieces of information were more powerful than food or medicine. "It made us feel human again," one former prisoner later said. "We weren't just numbers, we were part of something greater." Of course, the danger was real. If anyone discovered the radio, it would be taken away instantly. But the men accepted that risk, because the feeling of hearing the world again was worth every moment of fear. And so, night after night, the Chronicle continued, a secret newspaper made of courage. No walls could stop the sound of hope. The radio had done more than share the news. It had awakened something, the idea that imagination could keep them free. And soon, that same imagination would take on a new form, with fabric, thread, and the courage to walk straight through the castle gates. While the secret radio whispered news from the outside, another kind of creativity was coming to life deep inside Colditz Castle. This time, it didn't involve wires or signals. It involved needles, cloth, and steady hands. In a small storage room near the main hall, a group of prisoners had turned the place into a hidden workshop. Their leader was Jacques, a French officer who had once worked in a theater costume department before the war. To the guards, he looked harmless, just another prisoner sewing torn uniforms. But behind the closed door, Jacques and his helpers were making something far more ambitious. They were creating disguises. Using scraps of old blankets, curtains, and leftover fabric, they began stitching together replicas of German uniforms and civilian clothes. They traded soap or bits of chocolate for thread. They used coffee grounds, shoe polish, and even crushed charcoal to dye the fabric. Buttons were carved from pieces of wood. Badges were drawn by hand, copied carefully from memory or from brief glances during roll call. Each new uniform was a work of art, stitched under candlelight, folded, and hidden inside false walls. The plan was bold. When the time was right, a man wearing one of these disguises would simply walk out the front gate. But to do that, they needed more than uniforms. They needed papers. So another team of prisoners started working on that problem. They studied the passes and ID cards that guards carried, and learned to copy them using hand-cut stamps, candle wax, and old ink pads. One man built a small printing press from spare parts. Another mixed soot and water to make ink. Together, they built an underground office, a place where imagination replaced any missing tool. Weeks passed, then months. The disguises improved. The papers looked more real. The men practiced walking with confidence, learning how to salute, how to speak short German phrases, how to carry themselves like real officers. Failure meant being caught, but success meant freedom. And slowly, the castle that once felt impossible to escape began to feel breakable. Every stitch, every mark, every silent rehearsal brought them one step closer to the gate. Soon, the time would come to test their work, to see if cloth, ink, and courage could really outsmart stone walls and iron doors. February 1944. The cold air outside the castle walls carried the smell of winter and smoke. Inside, two prisoners stood in front of a cracked mirror. They weren't wearing their usual worn-out uniforms. Tonight, they were dressed as German officers, complete with hats, badges, and carefully copied papers folded in their pockets. Their names were Pat Reed and Howard Wardle. For months, they had helped plan the disguises, studying every detail until they could pass for real soldiers. Now it was time to test everything. As the evening roll call ended, the two men carried toolboxes, props for their cover story. They would pretend to be electricians, called to fix a cable near the outer courtyard. The corridor felt longer than ever before. Each step echoed against the stone. "Keep your pace," Reed whispered. "No hurry, no fear." They reached the gate. A guard looked up from his post, glanced at their papers, then back at their uniforms. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the guard nodded and waved them through. Just like that, they were outside. Reed and Wardle walked across the bridge that led away from the castle. Behind them, Colditz stood silent, the place that had trapped hundreds of men, now fading into the fog. 10 minutes later, as they reached the edge of town, a loud horn sounded from inside the castle. Roll call again. The guards were counting. 2 names didn't answer. Alarm spread through the camp. Searchlights cut across the night. Wardle was found before dawn, calm, unharmed, still wearing the disguise. He smiled and said only, "Almost made it." Reed, however, disappeared. He slipped through the forests, crossed icy rivers, and after weeks of hiding, finally reached friendly territory. His escape was one of the few successful ones from Colditz. Years later, he would write about it, not as a tale of glory, but as a story of teamwork and creativity. Inside the castle, the remaining prisoners were proud, not jealous. They knew that every man who tried carried all of their hopes with him. The guards searched the rooms for hidden radios or tools, but the prisoners had already taken everything apart. The teapot, the wires, the notes, all gone, buried within the walls. The secret stayed safe. One man had escaped, but for those still inside, the mission wasn't over. Because Colditz wasn't just about leaving the castle. It was about keeping the spirit of freedom alive, no matter how strong the walls were. As the months passed, Colditz Castle grew quieter. The radio had been hidden away. The disguises were packed in secret spaces within the walls, and the great escape attempts had slowed. Outside, the war was changing. Inside, the men could only guess what each day might bring. But even when hope seemed far away, something powerful remained, a shared belief that imagination could outlast captivity. The prisoners found ways to fill their days with purpose. They formed small schools, teaching each other languages, science, or history. They carved chess pieces from soap, built model airplanes from scrap wood, and even performed plays to lift everyone's spirits. Laughter echoed through the halls again, a quiet, stubborn act of courage. Some men wrote journals or drew sketches of life inside the castle. Others repaired instruments and played music during evenings. For them, these moments weren't just pastimes. They were reminders that they were still themselves, still human, still free in mind and heart. One officer wrote in his diary, "They could lock the doors, but not our ideas." In their hidden world, creativity became resistance. Every drawing, every tune, every shared smile, was a way of saying, "We are still here." Sometimes they would talk about what they would do once they got home: the first meal, the first letter, the first walk in open air. These small dreams kept them going through the cold nights. And though many of their inventions, the radios, the disguises, the tunnels, were built to escape, their greatest creation was something invisible, a spirit that refused to give up. When spring came and the first signs of peace appeared, the men stood by the windows and watched the valley below. They didn't know when the gates would open, but they knew one thing for sure: the world outside was waiting for them, and they were ready to return to it. The castle had tried to contain them, but their ideas, their humor, their friendship, their hope had already escaped long before their bodies did. And so, in the coldest place they had ever known, the men of Colditz proved something timeless: that freedom isn't just a place you reach, it's a light you carry inside. April 1945. The long winter was finally ending. From the towers of Colditz Castle, the prisoners could hear distant sounds. Not thunder, but something different. It was the echo of engines, moving closer each day. Rumors spread quietly through the halls. The men whispered, "It's almost over." And then, one morning, it was. Ally forces reached the town of Colditz. The gates opened for the last time, not for another inspection, but for freedom. The prisoners stepped outside into the sunlight, some walking slowly, some crying, all of them blinking against the brightness of the world they had dreamed about for years. Soldiers searched the castle afterward, documenting what they found. Among the papers and old supplies, they discovered a small notebook filled with numbers and hand-drawn sketches. It was a radio design, the same model the prisoners had built in secret. In another room, they found parts of a teapot, wires, and a thin strip of paper that read, "Last signal received, April 3rd, 1945. No one had ever discovered it during the war. To the world outside, Colditz was just another fortress. But to the men who lived inside, it had been a workshop of ideas, a place where imagination refused to die. Years later, historians and former prisoners would look back and realize what had really happened within those walls. There were no great battles there, no victories measured in land or weapons. But there was something far greater: proof that human creativity could survive even under the heaviest pressure. One of the men later wrote, "The real prison was never the castle. It was fear, and we escaped that long before the gates opened." Those words became the lasting truth of Colditz. The secret radio, the handmade uniforms, the tiny notes of news, all of them were more than clever tricks. They were acts of faith. Faith that someday the world would hear their story. Today, Colditz Castle still stands. The walls have been repaired. The rooms are part museum, part memorial. Visitors walk through the old hallways and see the hidden spaces where the prisoners once worked. Some stand in front of a glass case holding a few simple objects: a broken headphone, a small coil of wire, and a sketch of a teapot with a tiny antenna drawn beside it. They look ordinary, but to those who know the story, they represent something extraordinary: creativity, friendship, the unbreakable will to stay human. More than 70 years later, the lessons of Colditz still echo far beyond its walls. When we face our own struggles, when life feels closed in or impossible, we can remember them, the men who built a radio out of scraps and found freedom in sound. Because freedom doesn't always begin with open doors. Sometimes it begins with a single idea and the courage to believe it can work. The story of Colditz Castle isn't just about prisoners and walls. It's about people. People who turned fear into invention and silence into sound. They didn't have weapons or power, but they had imagination, and that was enough to keep hope alive. The secret radio, the handmade disguises, the quiet courage shared between strangers, they remind us that freedom begins long before any gate opens. It begins in the mind. It begins in small acts of creativity and in the belief that no situation can take away our humanity. Today, when visitors walk through the halls of Colditz, they still feel that spirit, the same spark that once connected a hidden attic to the voice of the free world. This was one of the untold WW2 stories. Because sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones fought quietly, inside the human heart.